The fluorescent lights in that pediatric ICU hallway were the ugliest shade of green I had ever seen, and I remember thinking that if my son died under those lights, I would personally come back and repaint the entire hospital. Grant Sullivan was standing 6 feet away from me in a $3,000 suit that probably cost more than my car, and he was staring at me like I was a ghost. "Who was Wyatt?" he said. My hands were shaking. Not from fear. From 7 years of rage I had folded up so neatly I almost forgot it was there. "Your son," I said. The word hit him like a physical blow. His face went white. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. The great Grant Sullivan, CEO of Sullivan Logistics, worth something north of $2 billion. And he looked like a man who had just been told the building was on fire and the exits were locked. "That's not possible," he whispered. "It's very possible," I said. "He's 7. He has your eyes, your stubborn chin, and unfortunately your family's defective blood. He's in that room right now, hooked up to more machines than I can count, and the doctors say he needs a bone marrow donor. I'm not a match. You might be." He grabbed the door frame. His knuckles went white. His knees actually buckled. The billionaire who had once looked at me like I was dirt on his shoe was holding onto a hospital doorframe like it was the only thing keeping him on the earth. "Jenna," he said, and my name sounded broken in his mouth. "Don't," I said. "Don't say my name like you care. You lost that privilege 7 years ago when you told me I was complicating your life. I didn't come here for you. I came here for him. So you're going to walk into that room, you're going to let them draw your blood, and then you're going to sit down and shut up while I save our son's life. Understood?" He nodded. Just once. Like a man who had just realized the entire foundation of his world was built on a lie he told himself. And that is where I want to start. Not at the beginning, because the beginning was quiet, and the quiet is what made the explosion so loud. I want to start at the moment everything cracked open, and then I want to take you back to the night a snowstorm buried a Connecticut estate, and 2 lonely people made a decision that would cost one of them 7 years of his child's life. 7 years before that hospital hallway, I was 22 years old, and I was dusting a chandelier that cost more than my entire college education. The Sullivan estate sat on 14 acres in Greenwich, Connecticut, behind a wrought iron gate that looked like it belonged on a medieval castle and probably had better security than most small countries. The house itself was a Georgian colonial with 12 bedrooms, a wine cellar that could double as a bomb shelter, and a kitchen so big it had its own zip code. I know that last part is an exaggeration, but when you're mopping a floor that takes 45 minutes to cross, you start thinking in hyperbole. I was the live-in housekeeper, and before you picture me in some frilly French maid outfit, let me stop you right there. I wore jeans, a gray polo shirt with the Sullivan family crest embroidered on the pocket, and sneakers I bought at Target. My job was to keep a house that was already clean looking like it had never been touched by human hands, which, given the people who lived there, was probably the point. Grant Sullivan had inherited the estate and the empire when his father, Thomas Sullivan, dropped dead of a massive stroke during a board meeting, poetic in a grim sort of way. The man literally worked himself into a grave, and his son inherited the shovel. Grant was 29 at the time, already running the day-to-day operations of Sullivan Logistics, one of the largest private shipping and freight companies on the East Coast. When his father died, the board tried to eat him alive. His own uncle Paul made a play for the CEO chair within 2 weeks of the funeral. Grant crushed him. I didn't know the details, but I heard the staff whispering about it in the kitchen. Apparently, Grant walked into the boardroom, laid out a stack of financial documents that proved Paul had been embezzling, and said something along the lines of, "Anyone else? Nobody else." That was the kind of man Grant Sullivan was. Efficient, ruthless, emotionally sealed shut like a jar of preserves nobody was allowed to open. I didn't care about any of that when I took the job. I cared about the paycheck. My mother had died 18 months earlier after a 3-year battle with pancreatic cancer, and the medical debt she left behind was the kind of number that makes you laugh because crying doesn't fix it. I was drowning. I had dropped out of my nursing program at UConn to take care of her, and after she passed, I was left with a half-finished degree, a mountain of bills, and a grief so heavy I could barely stand up in the mornings. The Sullivan estate job paid $28 an hour with room and board included. That meant I could live in the little guest cottage behind the main house, eat food from a kitchen stocked with things I couldn't pronounce, and funnel every spare dollar toward the debt collectors who called me at least twice a week. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't a career. It was survival. And I was good at survival. The staff was small. There was Maria, the head housekeeper, who had been with the family for 20 years and ran the house like a 5-star general. There was Tom, the groundskeeper, a quiet guy in his 60s who talked to his roses more than he talked to people. And there was me, the new girl, The one who scrubbed the bathrooms on the third floor and tried not to think about the fact that the marble in the master bath was imported from Italy while my mother had died in a hospital room with a broken radiator. I kept my head down. I did my work. I studied for my nursing exams at night on a laptop that was held together with duct tape and prayers. I didn't interact with Grant Sullivan more than was absolutely necessary, which was to say almost never. He was gone most of the time, flying to meetings in New York, Boston, Chicago, wherever his empire needed him. When he was home, he moved through the house like a shadow. He'd come in late, go straight to his study, and close the door. Sometimes I'd hear him on conference calls at 2 a.m, his voice low and sharp through the walls. He never said good morning. He never said thank you. I don't think he even knew my name for the first 3 months I worked there. And honestly, I preferred it that way. I didn't need a relationship with my employer. I needed a paycheck and a quiet place to study. The less he noticed me, the better. Then came February. Connecticut in February is not for the faint of heart. The cold gets into your bones and stays there like an unwelcome house guest. The nor'easter that hit on the 14th, yes, Valentine's Day, because the universe has a sick sense of humor, was one of the worst storms the state had seen in a decade. The Weather Service threw around words like historic and life-threatening and do not travel, which is Weather Service speak for you're going to die if you go outside. By noon, the roads were gone. The power lines started snapping around 3. The estate's backup generator kicked in, which meant the house stayed warm and lit while the rest of Greenwich went dark. Maria left early to get home to her family in Stamford before the highways closed. Tom bunked down in the tool shed because he said he'd survived worse in the blizzard of '78, and he wasn't about to let a little snow scare him now. I stayed because the guest cottage was right there and I had nowhere else to go. By 8 o'clock that night, the snow was piling up against the windows, and the wind was howling like something out of a horror movie. I was in the kitchen making myself a bowl of soup, one of the perks of working in a house with a pantry the size of a grocery store, when I heard the front door slam. Grant was home. That alone was unusual. He was supposed to be in Manhattan for some logistics summit. The storm must have grounded him. I heard his footsteps in the foyer, heavy and uneven, and then the sound of glass breaking. Not a small glass. A big glass. The kind of glass that shatters against a wall and leaves a stain on the plaster. I should have stayed in the kitchen. I should have minded my business. That was the smart thing to do. But I heard something else, a sound I didn't expect from a man who ran a $1 billion company and apparently intimidated his own board of directors into submission. He was crying, not the quiet, dignified kind of crying you see in movies. This was ugly. This was the kind of crying that comes out of your chest like it's being ripped out of you. I stood in the kitchen doorway and watched him slide down the wall in the foyer, his overcoat still on, snow melting in his hair, his face buried in his hands. He was shaking. "Walk away, Jenna. This is not your business. He is your employer. He is a billionaire. He has people for this." I walked over anyway. I sat down on the floor next to him. Not too close. Just close enough that he knew someone was there. I didn't say anything for a long time. The wind screamed outside. The generator hummed. And Grant Sullivan, the man who hadn't spoken more than 10 words to me in 3 months, started talking. He told me about his father, not the public version, the real one. The man who missed every birthday, every graduation, every moment that mattered because the company always came first. He told me about the board meeting where his father collapsed, how he watched the paramedics load him onto a stretcher, while the board members argued about stock prices in the hallway. He told me about his uncle's betrayal, the embezzlement, the feeling of realizing that the people who were supposed to be family were actually vultures circling a carcass. "I don't have anyone," he said. His voice was raw. "I have employees. I have shareholders. I have lawyers. I don't have a single person in this house who gives a damn whether I come home at night or not." I looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time, I didn't see the CEO or the estate owner or the man whose family crest was embroidered on my polo shirt. I saw a guy who was my age, give or take, sitting alone in a mansion that was too big for one person, on the worst night of the year, telling a stranger the things he couldn't tell anyone else. "I give a damn," I said. I don't know why I said it. Maybe because I knew what it felt like to be that alone. Maybe because my mother had been dead for 18 months and I still hadn't found anyone to sit with me in the quiet. Maybe because the storm had stripped away all the layers, the money, the titles, the hierarchy, and left 2 human beings on a cold floor in a dark house. One thing led to another. I'm not going to narrate every detail because that's not the point of this story, and frankly, it's none of your business. What I will say is that it wasn't predatory. It wasn't calculated. It wasn't some fantasy I'd been cooking up while I dusted his bookshelves. It was two people who were hurting, and for one night, the hurting stopped. The morning after was a different story. I woke up in the guest cottage alone. The storm had passed. The sun was out, reflecting off 3 feet of snow like the world had been dipped in glass. I got dressed, walked to the main house, and started my shift like nothing had happened, because that's what professionals do. Grant was in the kitchen when I walked in. He was on his phone, drinking black coffee, wearing a crisp white shirt like the night before had been a hallucination. He looked up when I entered. Our eyes met, and then he looked away. Not a flicker, not a nod, not a good morning. He turned his back to me and continued his phone call as if I were a piece of furniture that had been moved to the wrong room. Okay, fine, I get it. It was a mistake. We move on. I told myself I was fine with it. I told myself I didn't expect anything. I was the housekeeper. He was the billionaire. The power dynamic was so lopsided it was practically a cliff, and I wasn't stupid enough to think one night in a snowstorm changed the laws of gravity. But then 2 months later, I threw up in the third-floor bathroom, and the pregnancy test I bought at the CVS in downtown Greenwich came back positive, and suddenly the laws of gravity didn't matter anymore. I stared at that little pink plus sign for a long time. I sat on the edge of the bathtub in a bathroom that was bigger than my entire childhood apartment, and I felt the world tilt on its axis. I was 22, I was broke, I was alone, and I was going to be a mother. I didn't panic. I want to be very clear about that. I didn't spiral. I didn't cry. I sat there, I breathed, and I made a decision. I was going to tell him. Not because I wanted anything from him, not because I thought he'd sweep me into his arms and propose on the marble staircase. I was going to tell him because he deserved to know, and because I refused to start my child's life with a secret that big. I waited until the next morning. I walked into his home office, a room I was only allowed to enter on Tuesdays to dust the bookshelves, and I stood in front of his mahogany desk. He was typing on his laptop, surrounded by financial reports and a crystal decanter of scotch that probably cost more than my monthly salary. "Grant," I said. He didn't look up. "I'm busy, Jenna." He knew my name. That was the first time he'd used it in months, and he used it like it was an inconvenience. "I need 2 minutes of your time," I said. "This isn't about the house." He finally looked up. His expression was the same one he probably used in boardrooms when someone presented a quarterly loss. Cold, impatient, already calculating the fastest way to end the conversation. I told him. I said the words clearly, without flinching, without apologizing. "I'm pregnant. The baby is yours. I'm not asking for anything. I just thought you should know." The silence that followed was the loudest thing I have ever heard. Grant leaned back in his leather chair. He folded his hands. He looked at me the way you look at a stain on a carpet that you're trying to figure out how to remove. "Jenna," he said, and his voice was so calm it made my skin crawl. "You were hired to clean my house, not complicate my life." The words landed like a slap. Not because they were loud, but because they were quiet. Because he said them without a shred of emotion, like he was discussing a scheduling conflict. "I am not a complication. I am a human being carrying your child. My lawyers will handle the situation," he said. He turned back to his laptop. The conversation was over. I stood there for a moment, feeling something inside me harden into something I didn't recognize. It wasn't sadness. It wasn't anger. It was clarity. The kind of clarity that comes when someone shows you exactly who they are and you finally believe them. I walked out of that office without saying another word. The next day his mother arrived. Diane Sullivan was a woman who looked like she had been assembled in a factory that specialized in old money intimidation. She wore pearls the size of grapes, drove a silver Mercedes that she parked on the circular drive like she owned the pavement, and walked through the house like every surface was personally offending her. She hadn't spoken more than 5 words to me in the entire time I'd worked there, and all 5 of those words were, "Move out of my way." She and Grant had a meeting in the library. I wasn't invited, obviously, but the walls in that house were thin in all the wrong places, and I was in the hallway folding linens when I heard her voice carry through the oak door. "These girls throw themselves at men like you, Grant. It's not your problem. She'll disappear on her own. They always do." I stopped folding. My hands went still on the cotton sheet. "And if she doesn't disappear, Grant asked. His voice was flat. Bored, almost. Then we make her, Diane said. Quietly, cleanly, before this becomes a public embarrassment. The last thing Sullivan Logistics needs is a scandal involving the help. The help. She said it like it was a disease, like I was a stain on the family name that needed to be scrubbed out before the guests arrived. I didn't cry. I want to say that again because I think it matters. I didn't cry in that hallway. I finished folding the linens. I put them away. I went back to the guest cottage, packed my car, a 2014 Honda Civic that had more duct tape than paint, and I drove away from the Sullivan estate at 11 o'clock at night. I didn't leave a note. I didn't leave a forwarding address. I took my dignity, my laptop, and the life growing inside me, and I left. That was the last time I saw Grant Sullivan for 7 years. 7 years is a long time. Long enough to finish a nursing degree. Long enough to bury your debt. Long enough to build something from nothing with your bare hands and a stubbornness that scares most people. Long enough to raise a child who becomes the entire reason you breathe. I moved to New Haven. I rented a studio apartment above a laundromat that smelled like fabric softener and regret. I re-enrolled at UConn, finished my nursing program, and graduated with honors while 6 months pregnant. I gave birth to Wyatt in a hospital room that was nothing like the ones the Sullivans would have used. No private suite, no concierge doctor, just a tired nurse named Patty who held my hand and told me I was doing great. Wyatt James Collins came into the world at 7 pounds, 4 ounces, screaming like he already had opinions about the state of things. He had dark hair, pale skin, and eyes that were so blue they looked like they'd been stolen from a Connecticut sky in October. He also had Grant's jawline and that little crooked left thumb that ran in the Sullivan family, and every time I looked at his hands, I felt a pang of something I refused to name. I raised him alone. I worked double shifts at Yale New Haven Hospital. I picked up extra hours at a walk-in clinic on weekends. I learned how to stretch a dollar so thin it became transparent. And I never, not once, told Wyatt that his father was a billionaire who lived in a mansion in Greenwich and probably didn't remember my name. When Wyatt was old enough to ask questions, around 4, he looked up at me. One night, while I was reading him a bedtime story, and said, "Mom, where's my dad?" My heart cracked open like an egg on a countertop. "Your dad isn't in the picture right now, baby," I said. "But you have me, and you have Auntie Becca, and you have more love in this apartment than most people have in their giant houses. Okay?" He thought about that for a second, his little brow furrowed in that serious way that always made me want to laugh and cry at the same time. "Okay," he said, "but if he shows up, can he sleep on the couch? Because I don't want to share my bed." I laughed so hard I almost dropped the book. That's my boy. Becca Moore was my best friend and the only person in the world who knew the full story. We met during nursing school, bonded over a shared hatred of anatomy exams and a shared love of terrible reality television, and became inseparable. When I told her about Grant, about the pregnancy, about the way Diane Sullivan had talked about me like I was garbage, Becca's reaction was immediate and violent. "I will fight that woman," she said. "I don't care how many pearls she's wearing. I will throw hands in a Mercedes dealership." I loved her for that. When Wyatt was 3, Becca and I started Collins and More Care. The idea was simple, affordable, in-home medical support for elderly and disabled patients in working-class neighborhoods. The kind of care my mother never got because we couldn't afford it. We started with 2 clients in a shared office in a strip mall next to a nail salon. Within 4 years, we had 40 employees, 300 clients, and a waiting list that made my chest tight with pride every time I looked at it. I wasn't rich. I wasn't flying private or wearing designer clothes or attending galas in ball gowns. But I was stable. I was respected. I was building something real. And every time I walked into a patient's home and saw the relief on their family's face, I thought about my mother, and I knew I was doing exactly what I was supposed to do. Wyatt was 7 when everything changed. He was in 2nd grade at a public school in New Haven, and he was the kind of kid who made his teachers cry at the end of the year because they didn't want to let him go. He was quiet, brilliant, and deeply empathetic. He once made me sit in the car for 20 minutes because he saw a worm on the sidewalk and insisted on moving it to the grass so it wouldn't get stepped on. He also had a rare genetic blood disorder called paroxysmal nocturnal hemoglobinuria, which is a mouthful of a name for a disease that basically means his immune system attacks his own red blood cells while he sleeps. The disorder ran in the Sullivan family. I knew that because I'd overheard Diane mentioning it during one of her visits to the estate, talking about how Grant's grandfather had died from complications. I'd had Wyatt tested when he was 2, after he started bruising easily and his energy levels dropped. The diagnosis hit me like a truck, but I didn't fall apart. I couldn't. Wyatt needed me steady, so I became steady. I managed his treatments, his medications, his doctor's appointments. I learned more about hematology than most medical students. I fought with insurance companies until they blocked my number, and then I called from Becca's phone. We were managing it, barely, but we were managing. Then came the gala. Collins and Moorcare had landed a contract to provide on-site medical support for the Sullivan Logistics Annual Charity Gala in Boston. Becca was the one who secured it. She was better at the business development side than I was, and she'd been aggressively networking with event planners for months. I didn't know the Sullivan name was attached to the event until the contract was already signed. When I saw the logo on the paperwork, my stomach dropped. "You can back out," Becca said, reading my face. "I'll find a replacement team." I shook my head. "No, I'm not going to let that man's name dictate where I can and can't work. We need the revenue. I'll be fine." "You will be fine. You are a grown woman with a successful business and a child who thinks you hung the moon. You are not going to let a billionaire who forgot you existed ruin your Tuesday." The gala was held at the Seaport Hotel in Boston, and it was exactly the kind of event that made me want to roll my eyes into the back of my skull. Crystal chandeliers, ice sculptures, a string quartet playing covers of pop songs for people who had never heard the originals, women in gowns that cost more than my rent, men in tuxedos who talked about their portfolios like they were describing their children. My team and I were set up in a back corridor near the ballroom, ready to handle any medical emergencies, fainting, allergic reactions, the occasional drunk executive who tripped over a centerpiece. I was wearing a simple black blazer over a white blouse, my hair pulled back, my nurse's badge clipped to my lapel. I looked professional. I looked capable. I looked nothing like the 22-year-old girl who used to dust Grant Sullivan's chandeliers. I was checking our supply kit when I felt the shift in the room. You know that feeling when someone walks into a space and the air changes, like the oxygen gets pulled toward them? That's what happened when Grant Sullivan walked into the ballroom. He was older, 36 now. His hair was a little shorter, his jaw a little sharper, and there were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there 7 years ago. He was wearing a tuxedo that fit him like it had been tailored by angels, and on his arm was a woman I didn't recognize. Tall, blonde, dripping in diamonds, with the kind of smile that looked like it had been focus grouped. That must be the fiancé. Good for him. I hope she likes the sound of her own voice, because he's not going to listen to hers. I turned back to my supply kit. I was not going to stare. I was not going to react. I was a professional, and this was a job. And the fact that my ex, if you could, even call a one-night stand an ex, was in the same building was irrelevant. Then he saw me. I felt his eyes before I saw them. It was like a physical weight pressing against the side of my face. I looked up. Grant was standing near the entrance, his champagne glass frozen halfway to, his mouth staring at me across the ballroom like he'd just seen a ghost. The woman on his arm said something to him. He didn't respond. He just kept staring. "Look away, Grant. Do us both a favor and pretend you don't know me. It's what you're best at." He looked away. Just like that, his eyes slid off me like I was a piece of furniture he'd already decided to replace. And he turned back to his fiancée with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. My hands were shaking. I shoved them into my pockets and took a deep breath. You knew this would happen. You prepared for this. You are not that girl anymore. The night went on. I managed a minor allergic reaction at table 12 and a sprained ankle near the dance floor. I avoided the main ballroom. I stayed in my lane, and then, around 10 o'clock, I stepped into the back hallway to grab a fresh box of gloves, and I found myself face to face with the blonde fiancée. She was standing near the service entrance, scrolling through her phone, and when she saw me, her eyes narrowed in that specific way that wealthy women have perfected, the look that says, "I know exactly what you are, and you are not enough." "Can I help you?" she said. Her tone was polite in the way that a knife is polite when it's still in the sheath. "I'm the lead medical coordinator for the event," I said. "I'm just restocking supplies." She looked me up and down. Her gaze lingered on my blazer, my badge, my very reasonable Target shoes. "Right," she said. "Well, I don't know what history you think you have with my fiancé, but the help should stay in the back." The help. 7 years later, and the words still tasted the same. Like ash, like poison, like a door slamming in my face. I looked at her. I didn't blink. I didn't flinch. I let the silence stretch just long enough to make her uncomfortable. And then I smiled, the kind of smile that has teeth behind it. "I'm the CEO of the medical team keeping your guests alive tonight," I said. "But sure, honey, whatever helps you sleep." I walked past her without looking back. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat, but my steps were steady and my spine was straight, and I did not give her the satisfaction of seeing me rattled. "You are not the help. You are not the girl in the snowstorm. You are Jenna Collins, and you built something real while that man was busy building his net worth." The gala ended at midnight. My team packed up. We drove back to New Haven. I put Wyatt to bed when I got home, kissed his forehead, and sat in my kitchen staring at the wall until the sun came up. 3 weeks later, Wyatt collapsed at school. The call came at 2:15 in the afternoon. I was at the office reviewing a new client intake form when my phone buzzed. The school nurse's name was Linda, and her voice was shaking when she told me that Wyatt had fainted during recess and wouldn't wake up. I don't remember the drive to the school. I don't remember the ambulance. I remember the sound of the helicopter blades cutting through the air above the school parking lot. And I remember thinking that my son was being airlifted to Boston Children's Hospital, and I was sitting in the back of an ambulance watching his small chest rise and fall through an oxygen mask, and I could not lose him. I could not. I had already lost my mother. I had already lost everything else. If I lost this child, there would be nothing left of me to salvage. The doctors at Boston Children's were direct. Wyatt's blood disorder had escalated. His red blood cell count was critically low. The treatments we'd been managing were no longer enough. He needed a specialized bone marrow transplant, and the best chance of a compatible donor was a biological parent. I was tested immediately. I was not a match. Dr. Amy Thornton, the hematologist, sat across from me in a consultation room that smelled like antiseptic and bad coffee, and she said the words I had been dreading for 7 years. "We need the father, Miss Collins. Without a compatible donor, Wyatt's prognosis is very poor." I stared at her. My hands were gripping the arms of the chair so hard my knuckles were white. "You knew this day would come. You always knew. You just hoped you'd be strong enough to handle it alone." I wasn't strong enough. Not this time. This wasn't about pride. This wasn't about dignity. This was about my 7-year-old son, lying in a hospital bed with tubes in his arms and monitors beeping next to his head, and the only person who could save him was a man who had once told me I was complicating his life. I stepped into the hallway. I pulled out my phone. I scrolled to a number I had memorized 7 years ago and never deleted, even though I told myself I had. I pressed call. It rang 3 times. "This is Grant Sullivan," he said. His voice was the same, cold, efficient, impersonal. "It's Jenna," I said. Silence. A long, heavy silence that stretched across 7 years of absence. "Jenna Collins," I added, because apparently he needed the full name to jog his memory. "I know who you are," he said. His tone shifted. Something flickered behind the ice. Surprise, maybe, or guilt. I didn't care which. "Wyatt needs you," I said. "Who is Wyatt?" I closed my eyes. The fluorescent lights buzzed above me. A nurse walked past, pushing a cart of medications. Somewhere down the hall, a child was crying. "The boy you never knew existed," I said. "Your son. He's 7 years old and he's dying, and you're the only match. So I need you to get to Boston Children's Hospital as fast as your private jet can carry you, Grant. Because if you don't, I will spend the rest of my life making sure you understand exactly what your pride cost you." I hung up. I stood in that hallway with my phone pressed against my chest and my breath coming in short, sharp gasps, and I waited. I didn't know if he would come. I didn't know if he would believe me. I didn't know if 7 years of silence could be broken by a single phone call from a woman he had discarded like yesterday's newspaper. But I knew one thing. I knew that I had done everything I could. I had raised that boy alone. I had fought for every breath he took. I had swallowed my pride, my anger, my 7 years of justified rage, and I had made the call. Not for me, for Wyatt. And if Grant Sullivan walked through those hospital doors and tried to look at me the way he looked at me in that ballroom, like I was nothing, like I was the help, like I was a complication to be managed, I would break him. Not with tears, not with begging, with the truth. The truth was a weapon, and I had been sharpening it for 7 years. 40 minutes later, the elevator doors at the end of the hallway opened, and Grant Sullivan stepped out. He was still wearing his suit from the office. His tie was loosened. His hair was disheveled like he'd run his hands through it 100 times during the drive, or the flight, or whatever desperate journey had brought him here. He looked around the pediatric ICU like he'd never been in a hospital before, like the smell of antiseptic and the sound of beeping monitors were foreign to a man who lived in a world of private doctors and concierge medicine. His eyes found mine, and for the first time in 7 years the great Grant Sullivan looked afraid. I didn't move. I didn't soften. I stood in front of Wyatt's room with my arms crossed and my chin up and my heart beating so hard I thought it might crack my ribs, and I waited for him to cross the distance between us. He stopped a few feet away. His eyes dropped to the floor, then back to my face, then to the door behind me where his son, a child he never knew existed, was lying in a hospital bed fighting for his life. "Jenna," he said, and that is where I left him. Standing in a hospital hallway in Boston, Massachusetts, in a suit that cost more than most people's cars, realizing that the empire he had built, the billions he had accumulated, the power he had wielded like a weapon against everyone who ever tried to get close to him, none of it mattered. None of it could buy back the 7 years he had missed. None of it could undo the words he had said to a 22-year-old girl in a snowstorm. He had thrown me away, and now he was standing in front of me, and his knees were buckling, and the only thing keeping him upright was the doorframe of a room he should have walked into 7 years ago. But this story isn't about his pain. It's about mine. It's about Wyatt's. It's about what happens when a man who has everything realizes he has nothing, and a woman who had nothing realizes she had everything all along. The reckoning was just beginning. He walked past me without a word and pushed open the door to Wyatt's room. I stayed in the hallway. I wasn't going to follow him in like some anxious puppy waiting for approval. This was his moment to reckon with what he'd missed, and I was not going to cushion the landing. Through the glass panel in the door, I watched him stop at the foot of the bed. Wyatt was asleep, his small body almost swallowed by the hospital blankets, an IV line snaking into the back of his hand, a heart monitor beeping a steady rhythm that was the only sound keeping me sane. His dark hair was fanned out on the pillow. His skin was pale, too pale, the kind of pale that makes doctors use words like critical and urgent and we need to move quickly. Grant stood there for a long time. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He just stared at the boy in the bed, and I watched his entire body language collapse in real time. His shoulders dropped, his hands unclenched, his head tilted slightly to the left, the same way Wyatt tilted his head when he was trying to understand something that didn't make sense. The resemblance was not subtle. It was not something you could talk yourself out of. It was the kind of genetic mirror that made strangers in grocery stores stop and stare. Wyatt had Grant's deep-set blue eyes, his sharp jawline, the slight cleft in his chin that I used to trace with my fingertip when he was a baby and sleeping on my chest. He even had Grant's hands, long fingers, narrow palms, that crooked left thumb that bent at an angle no other thumb in my family had ever bent. Grant reached out and grabbed the bed rail. His knuckles went white. His breathing became audible even through the glass, ragged, shallow, like he was trying to pull air through a straw. And then his knees gave out. He sank into the plastic chair next to the bed and put his face in his hands. And the great Grant Sullivan, the man whose net worth was discussed, on CNBC like it was a spectator sport, broke apart in a pediatric ICU, room under fluorescent lights that made everyone look terrible. Good. You should feel this. You should feel every single second of the 7 years you missed. I gave him 5 minutes. Then I walked in. He looked up when he heard the door. His eyes were red. His face was wet. He didn't try to hide it, which surprised me. The Grant I remembered would have rather died than let anyone see him cry. Maybe 7 years had changed that. Maybe the sight of your dying child will do that to a man regardless of how many billions he has in the bank. Is he really mine? He asked. His voice was barely a whisper. I pulled up a chair on the other side of the bed, as far from him as the small room allowed. He has your blood disorder, Grant. The same one that killed your grandfather. The same one your mother mentioned at least twice while I was working in your house. Do the math. He flinched at the mention of Diane. Interesting. I didn't know, he said. Jenna, I swear to God, I didn't know he existed. I believe you, I said. And I did. That was the worst part. I believed that he genuinely didn't know, which meant someone had made sure he didn't know, and that someone was almost certainly the woman who had called me the help and predicted I would disappear on my own. But that doesn't change what happened, I continued. You didn't know about Wyatt because you never asked. You told your lawyers to handle the situation and then you moved on with your life. You got engaged, you tripled your company's valuation, you went on magazine covers, and I was in a studio apartment above a laundromat figuring out how to pay for my son's chemotherapy drugs. So don't sit there and tell me you didn't know like it absolves you. Not knowing was a choice you made. He opened his mouth to argue, then closed it. His jaw tightened. I could see the CEO brain working behind his eyes, calculating, strategizing, looking for the angle that would let him control the narrative. I knew that look. I'd seen it 7 years ago in his home office when he told me I was complicating his life. What do you need from me? He asked. His tone shifted into transaction mode. Clean, efficient, the same voice he probably used when negotiating shipping contracts. I'll do whatever it takes. Money, resources, the best specialists in the country. Name it. I stared at him. I let the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable, until he shifted in his chair and looked away. I don't need your money, I said. I need your bone marrow. That's it. You're going to get tested. If you're a match, you're going to donate. And then you're going to let me decide what happens next, because Wyatt is my son. I have raised him alone for 7 years. I have held him through every fever, every transfusion, every night he woke up screaming because his bones hurt. You don't get to walk in here with your checkbook and your private jet and your guilt and suddenly become a father. That's not how this works. He nodded slowly. Okay, he repeated. You set the terms. I'll follow them. Too easy. Men like Grant Sullivan don't surrender control that quickly. He's regrouping. He's figuring out how to manage this the way he manages everything else, as a problem to be solved, not a relationship to be earned. The testing process took 48 hours. 48 hours during which Grant Sullivan essentially moved into the pediatric wing of Boston Children's Hospital, much to the bewilderment of the nursing staff and the absolute delight of the hospital's PR department, who apparently saw a billionaire CEO sitting in a plastic chair next to a sick child as a branding opportunity. I caught a hospital administrator trying to take a photo of Grant sleeping in the waiting room, and I shut that down so fast the woman's phone nearly flew out of her hand. This is not a press event, I told her. This is a 7-year-old boy fighting for his life. If I see a camera anywhere near this floor, I will personally make sure Sullivan Logistics' next charity gala gets picketed. The administrator scurried away. Grant, who had been watching from the doorway, gave me a look I couldn't quite read. Something between admiration and fear. Good. Fear is healthy. Fear means you understand the stakes. During those 48 hours we existed, in a strange, suffocating proximity that neither of us had asked for. We shared a waiting room. We shared terrible hospital coffee. We shared the sound of Wyatt's heart monitor beeping through the wall. And we did not share a single conversation that wasn't strictly about logistics. He tried once. It was the second night, around 2 a.m, and I was sitting in the hallway with my laptop balanced, on my knees, trying to respond to emails from Becca about a client intake crisis back in New Haven. Grant came out of the cafeteria with 2 cups of coffee and sat down next to me. You should sleep, he said. I'll sleep when my son is out of the ICU. Jenna, don't, I said, not looking up from my screen. Don't do the concerned voice. Don't try to take care of me. You lost that right a long time ago, and a cup of hospital coffee is not going to buy it back. He set the coffee down next to me anyway, and walked away. I drank it. It was terrible. I needed it. The results came back on a Thursday morning. Dr. Thornton walked into the consultation room with a folder in her hands and a look on her face that I had learned to read over the past 3 days, the careful neutrality of a doctor who is about to deliver news that could go either way. Mr. Sullivan is a match, she said. I exhaled a breath I didn't know I was holding. My vision blurred for a second, and I blinked hard because I was not going to cry in front of Dr. Thornton or Grant or anyone else in that room. A match. He's a match. Wyatt is going to be okay. Wyatt is going to live. Grant let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. He pressed his palms against his eyes and shook his head. Thank God, he whispered. Thank God. The transplant was scheduled for the following Monday. That gave us 4 days to prepare, which meant 4 days of Grant Sullivan trying to figure out how to exist in a space he had no power over. And I have to admit, in the interest of honesty, watching a billionaire CEO get told he couldn't park his car in the ambulance bay was one of the more satisfying moments of my adult life. "Sir, this is an emergency vehicle zone," the security guard said, pointing at Grant's black Range Rover like it was a crime scene. "I'm the father of a patient on the 4th floor," Grant said, using the tone that probably made board members sweat. "And I'm the guy who's going to tow your car if you don't move it," the security guard said, completely unimpressed. "4th floor parking garage, level C. Have a nice day." Grant looked at me like he expected me to intervene. I shrugged. "He's right. Level C. The elevator is slow, so you might want to budget extra time." The corner of his mouth twitched. I think he almost smiled. I looked away before he could confirm it. Wyatt woke up on Saturday morning. He'd been in and out of consciousness for days, drifting through a fog of medications and blood transfusions, and when he finally opened his eyes and looked around the room with that clear, sharp awareness that always made me feel like he was the one taking care of me and not the other way around, my heart did something complicated in my chest. "Mom?" he said. His voice was small and scratchy. "I'm right here, baby." I was at his side in a second, smoothing his hair back from his forehead, checking his IV line out of habit. "How are you feeling?" "Like I got hit by a truck," he said. "A really big truck, like the ones in your friend's shipping company." I froze. How does he know about the shipping company? "What friend?" I asked carefully. "The man who's been sleeping in the chair," Wyatt said, nodding toward the corner of the room where Grant had spent the last 2 nights in a plastic recliner that was clearly designed to punish the human spine. "He told me his name is Grant, and he works in logistics. He said logistics means moving things from one place to another. I told him that sounded boring, and he said it was, but it paid for his house." I closed my eyes. Of course he introduced himself to my 7-year-old son while I was in the cafeteria getting food. Of course he did. "Mom, is he my dad?" The question landed in the room like a grenade. The heart monitor beeped steadily. The IV dripped. The fluorescent lights hummed, and my 7-year-old son looked up at me with Grant Sullivan's blue eyes and asked the question I had been dreading since the day he was born. I sat down on the edge of the bed. I took his hand, his small, warm hand with the crooked left thumb, and I told him the truth, because Wyatt deserved the truth, and because I had promised myself I would never lie to him, not even when the truth was complicated. "Yes," I said, "he is." Wyatt was quiet for a long time. He looked at Grant, who was standing in the doorway with the expression of absolute terror on his face. A man who had faced hostile takeovers and boardroom coups and apparently found none of them as frightening as a 7-year-old boy processing his existence. "Why wasn't he here before?" Wyatt asked. "Because he threw me away. Because his mother intercepted my letter. Because he was too busy building his empire to wonder if the girl he slept with in a snowstorm might have been telling the truth when she said she was pregnant." "That's a long story, baby," I said. "And it's not a simple one. But what I can tell you is that he's here now, and he's going to help you get better, and we're going to figure the rest out later, okay?" Wyatt considered this. He had the Sullivan stubbornness, the same furrowed brow, the same calculating silence, and watching it play out on his small face was like looking at a time-lapse of the man standing in the doorway. "Okay," Wyatt said finally, "but he has to bring me ice cream, the good kind, not the hospital kind." Grant, who had been listening from the doorway with the expression of a man watching a bomb defusal, stepped forward. "I can do ice cream," he said. His voice was gentle in a way I had never heard from him before, careful, tentative, like he was handling something fragile that he was terrified of breaking. "Chocolate?" Wyatt asked. "Whatever you want. Can I have 2 scoops? "Wyatt," I said. 3 scoops? Wyatt tried, looking at Grant with an expression of pure manipulation that he absolutely learned from Becca. Grant looked at me. I shook my head. He looked back at Wyatt. 2 scoops, he said, and that's final. Wyatt grinned. It was the first real smile I'd seen on his face in weeks, and it hit me so hard I had to turn away and pretend to adjust his IV line so he wouldn't see my eyes fill up. He's going to be okay. He's going to get the transplant. He's going to live. And somehow, impossibly, the man who broke my heart 7 years ago is standing in a hospital room negotiating ice cream scoops with our son and the world has not ended. The transplant was scheduled for Monday morning. Sunday night, the calm shattered. Tara showed up. I was in the family waiting room on the 4th floor, trying to eat a sandwich that tasted like cardboard, when the elevator doors opened, and a woman in a cream-colored cashmere coat and heels that had no business being in a hospital marched down the hallway like she owned the building. Tara Whitfield, Grant's fiancée, the woman who had called me the help at the gala 3 weeks ago. She was carrying a designer handbag that probably cost more than my monthly rent, and her expression was the kind of furious that comes from a woman who has just discovered that her carefully curated life has a crack in it. She spotted Grant coming out of Wyatt's room, and her voice carried down the entire hallway. "Grant, what is this?" Grant's face went rigid. "Tara, not here. Not here." She laughed, and it was the kind of laugh that had sharp edges. "You've been in this hospital for 3 days. You missed the Henderson dinner. You missed the board call on Friday. Your assistant told me you were dealing with a family medical emergency. And I assumed it was Diane, because that's the only family you talk about. And then I call the hospital, and they tell me you're registered as the father of a patient on the pediatric floor." The hallway went quiet. Nurses stopped at their stations. A janitor paused mid-mop. I set my sandwich down and stood up. "Tara," Grant said, his voice dropping into that dangerous low register I remembered from 7 years ago. "We are not doing this here." "We are absolutely doing this here," she said, "because apparently your entire life is a lie, and I'd like to know who this woman is and why she has a child with your last name on his medical chart." "His last name is Collins, actually." "But sure, let's not let facts get in the way of a good tantrum." I walked into the hallway. I didn't rush. I didn't posture. I just walked up to where Tara was standing, looked her directly in the eye and said, "His name is Wyatt Collins. He's 7 years old. He has a rare blood disorder, and his father, who you are apparently engaged to, is donating bone marrow tomorrow to save his life. So unless you have a compatible marrow type hiding in that handbag, I'd suggest you lower your voice before you wake up every sick child on this floor." Tara stared at me. Her eyes flicked to Grant, then back to me. Her mouth opened, closed, opened again. She was calculating. I could see it happening in real time, the social arithmetic of a woman trying to figure out whether screaming louder would help or hurt her position. "You," she said, recognition dawning on her face, "you were at the gala." "The medical coordinator." "CEO," I corrected. "We went over this." "Grant," Tara said, turning to him with a voice that was suddenly very controlled and very cold. "We need to talk, privately." "There's nothing to talk about," Grant said, and the way he said it, flat, final, without a trace of the deference I'd seen him show her at the gala, told me everything I needed to know about the state of their relationship. Tara's eyes narrowed. She looked at me one more time, and I saw something behind the fury that I recognized because I had felt it myself 7 years ago. Humiliation. She had built her identity around being Grant Sullivan's fiancée, around the status and the access in the magazine covers, and now she was standing in a pediatric hospital hallway, realizing that none of it was as solid as she thought. "This isn't over," she said. She turned on her heel and walked back to the elevator. The doors closed behind her with a soft chime that felt oddly final. Grant ran a hand through his hair. "I'm sorry about that." "Don't apologize to me," I said. "Apologize to the kid in room 412 whose mother just had to listen to your fiancé scream about her social calendar while her son is fighting for his life." He winced. "Good. The transplant happened on Monday at 6 in the morning. I sat in the surgical waiting room for 7 hours. 7 hours of staring at a clock that moved slower than any clock in the history of time. 7 hours of drinking coffee that tasted like battery acid. 7 hours of Becca texting me updates from New Haven. Wyatt is a warrior. I'm praying so hard my knees hurt. If anything goes wrong, I will personally sue the entire medical establishment." While I sat in a plastic chair and tried not to think about all the things that could go wrong during a bone marrow transplant in a child with a compromised immune system, Grant was in recovery on the 3rd floor. The donation procedure was less invasive than the transplant itself. They harvested the marrow from his hip bone under general anesthesia, but it was still surgery, and when I checked on him during a bathroom break, he was groggy and pale and lying in a hospital bed that looked absurdly small for a man his size. "How's Wyatt?" he asked the moment I walked in. His voice was thick with anesthesia. "Still in surgery," I said. "It's going well. Dr. Thornton says the engraftment looks promising." He nodded and closed his eyes. "Good. That's good. Then, barely audible, I should have been there, for all of it. The birth, the first steps, the first day of school. I should have been there. I stood in the doorway and looked at him. This man who had discarded me like an inconvenience and was now lying in a hospital bed mourning the years he'd lost. And I felt something shift inside me. Not forgiveness. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But something softer than the rage I'd been carrying for 7 years. Something that felt dangerously close to empathy. Don't you dare soften. He doesn't get your empathy just because he's finally paying attention. I walked out without responding. Whit came out of surgery at 1:15 in the afternoon. Dr. Thornton met me in the hallway with a tired smile and said the words I had been waiting 7 years to hear. The transplant was successful. The early signs are very promising. He's going to need a long recovery, but Ms. Collins, your son is going to be okay. I cried. I stood in that hallway, and I cried so hard my legs gave out, and I slid down the wall, and Becca, who had driven up from New Haven that morning and was sitting in the waiting room, came running and held me while I shook apart in her arms. He's going to live. My baby is going to live. The recovery was slow. Bone marrow transplants are not magic wands. They're grueling, exhausting processes that require weeks of monitoring, blood tests, and immune system management. Wyatt spent 3 weeks in the hospital, and during those 3 weeks, Grant Sullivan essentially became a permanent fixture on the pediatric floor. He brought Wyatt books. He brought him puzzles. He brought him a stuffed bear the size of a small car that Wyatt named Mr. Logistics and refused to let go of even during blood draws. He sat by Wyatt's bed and read to him. Badly, I might add. His dramatic voices were genuinely terrible. And he let Wyatt ask him questions that made my chest ache with their simplicity. Dad, do you have a boat? I do, actually. Can it go fast? It can. Can we ride it when I get better? A pause. Grant looked at me across the bed, his eyes asking permission for something he knew he hadn't earned. I gave a small nod. Yeah, buddy, Grant said. We can ride it when you get better. Don't make promises you can't keep. Don't build a relationship on hospital goodwill and stuffed animals. This is not a fairy tale. This is real life. And real life has consequences that don't disappear just because the surgery went well. The reckoning came on a Tuesday afternoon, 2 weeks into Wyatt's recovery. I was in the hospital cafeteria getting lunch when my phone buzzed. It was Becca, and her text was 3 words long. Diane Sullivan's here. My blood went cold. I took the stairs back to the 4th floor 2 at a time. When I rounded the corner to Wyatt's room, I saw her. Diane Sullivan was standing in the hallway outside the room, wearing a navy blue coat and pearls that probably had their own insurance policy, and she was talking to Grant in a voice that was low and urgent and laced with a kind of authority that comes from decades of controlling every narrative in her orbit. You need to handle this quietly, she was saying. The press is already sniffing around. If the board finds out you have an illegitimate child, the stock price will— Stop! Grant's voice was ice. Just stop, Mom. I'm trying to protect you, Grant. You're trying to protect the brand. There's a difference. I walked up to them. Diane turned to face me, and for a split second I saw something flicker behind her polished exterior. Recognition, maybe, or the faintest shadow of guilt. Then it was gone, replaced by the same cold dismissal I remembered from 7 years ago. Jenna, she said. Her tone was the verbal equivalent of a limp handshake. How unfortunate that we meet again under these circumstances. Cut the act, Diane, I said. I was done being polite. I was done being the quiet girl who folded linens in the hallway while this woman discussed erasing her existence. I know about the letter. The color drained from Diane's face so fast it was like someone had pulled a plug. Grant turned to look at her. What letter? Diane's composure cracked. Just a hairline fracture, barely visible, but I saw it. I don't know what she's talking about. Yes, you do, I said. My voice was steady. My hands were not shaking. I had waited 7 years for this moment, and I was not going to waste it on theatrics. After I left the estate, I wrote Grant a letter. I told him I was pregnant. I told him I wasn't asking for money or a relationship or anything except the basic decency of knowing his child existed. I mailed it to the estate, and you intercepted it. You destroyed it. And then you told Grant that I had taken care of the situation and moved on. You stole 7 years of his son's life, Diane. 7 birthdays, 7 Christmases, 7 years of firsts that he will never get back. And you did it because you were more concerned about your family's reputation than your grandchild's existence. The hallway was silent. A nurse at the station had stopped typing. The hum of the fluorescent lights seemed deafening. Grant stared at his mother. His face was a mask of something I had never seen on him before. Not anger, not sadness, but a kind of devastation that comes from realizing the person you trusted most in the world had been lying to you for nearly a decade. "Mom," he said. His voice was barely audible. "Is that true?" Diane straightened her coat. She lifted her chin. And even in that moment, cornered and exposed, she tried to control the narrative. "I did what I thought was best for the family, Grant. That girl was nobody. She was an employee. She was looking for a payday, and I protected you from a situation that would have destroyed your career and your reputation." "I was not looking for a payday," I said. My voice was quiet and sharp and absolutely lethal. "I was a 22-year-old girl who had just lost her mother, who was carrying your grandchild, and who was trying to do the right thing by telling your son the truth. You didn't protect him, Diane. You robbed him, and you robbed Wyatt of a father who could have been there for every doctor's appointment, every transfusion, every night he woke up in pain and asked me why his body was broken. That's on you, and you're going to have to live with that for the rest of your life." Diane's eyes filled with tears. Real tears, not the performative kind. She looked at Grant, and for the first time, she looked small. "Grant, please." "Get out," he said. "Grant, get out of this hospital. Get out of my son's life, and do not call me until I'm ready to talk to you, which may be never." Diane stood there for a moment, her pearls trembling against her collarbone, and then she turned and walked to the elevator. She didn't look back. The doors closed behind her, and the hallway felt like it exhaled. Grant turned to me. His eyes were red, his hands were shaking, and for the first time, he didn't try to manage the situation or control the narrative or negotiate his way out of the emotional wreckage. "I didn't know," he said. "Jenna, I swear to you, I didn't know about the letter. I thought you had just left. I thought you didn't want anything to do with me." "I know," I said, "and I believe you." "Then why?" He stopped, swallowed hard. "Why do you look at me like it's still my fault?" And there it was, the question I had been waiting for, the moment where the real reckoning began. I looked at him. I let him see every ounce of the 7 years I had carried alone. The exhaustion, the fear, the nights I sat in the bathroom with the door locked so Wyatt wouldn't hear me cry. The way I had to explain to my son why his father wasn't at his school play or his birthday party or his soccer games. I let him see all of it, and then I said the words I had been rehearsing in my head for 7 years. "Your mother lied to you. That's on her, and she will answer for it, but the night you looked me in the eye and called me a complication, the morning after the storm when you pretended I didn't exist, the way you told your lawyers to handle the situation like I was a legal problem and not a human being, no one put those words in your mouth, Grant. No one made you look at me like I was beneath you. That was all you. Your mother built the wall, but you laid the foundation, and that's the part you have to sit with." He didn't argue. He didn't deflect. He didn't try to explain or justify or minimize. He just stood there in that hospital hallway and took it. And I saw something break behind his eyes that I didn't think could be repaired with money or power or any of the tools he had spent his entire life accumulating. "You're right," he said quietly. "I was cruel to you. I was arrogant and selfish, and I treated you like you didn't matter. And I will spend the rest of my life trying to make that right, even if you never let me." I nodded. "I didn't say I forgive you. I wasn't ready. Maybe I would be someday. Maybe I wouldn't, but the truth had been spoken, and the air between us felt different. Lighter somehow, like a pressure valve had finally been released after 7 years of building steam. The next 2 weeks were a blur of medical appointments, blood tests, and the slow, miraculous process of watching Wyatt's body accept the new marrow. His color came back. His energy returned. He started complaining about the hospital food, which Dr. Thornton said was the best possible sign because it meant he was feeling well enough to be annoyed. Grant was there for all of it. He missed board meetings. He delegated his CEO responsibilities to his COO, a woman named Karen who apparently ran the company better than he did anyway. He slept in the hospital chair every night, even after I told him he didn't have to, even after the nurses started bringing him extra blankets because they felt sorry for his back. He was trying. I could see it. And I could also see the effort it cost him to resist the urge to fix everything with money and instead sit with the discomfort of earning something he couldn't buy. Tara's exit was quieter than her entrance, but far more consequential. 2 weeks after her hospital meltdown, Grant's head of security discovered that Tara had been leaking internal Sullivan logistics data to a rival firm for over a year. Shipping routes, client lists, pricing models, the kind of proprietary information that could tank a company's competitive advantage overnight. She'd been feeding it to her brother, who worked at a competing logistics firm in New Jersey, in exchange for a financial arrangement that was both illegal and spectacularly stupid. Grant handled it the way he handled everything in business, swiftly, ruthlessly, and without drama. He ended the engagement. He notified the board. He initiated legal proceedings. Tara's access to the Sullivan estate, the company accounts, and the social circles she had spent years cultivating was revoked within 48 hours. There was no screaming match, no public humiliation, just consequences, delivered with the same cold efficiency he had once used to dismantle his uncle's embezzlement scheme. I found out about it from Becca, who had been monitoring the situation with the enthusiasm of a woman who considered Tara's downfall a personal victory. "She's done," Becca said over the phone, her voice practically vibrating with satisfaction. "Completely done. Grant's lawyers are going after her for breach of contract and corporate espionage. She's going to be lucky if she can get a job managing a Cinnabon." Good, not because I wanted revenge, but because the universe has a way of balancing the scales, and it's nice to see it happen in real time instead of just in my imagination. Wyatt was discharged from the hospital on a Friday morning in late April. The Boston spring was in full bloom, cherry blossoms lining the streets, the air warm, and sharp, and full of the kind of promise that only comes after a long, brutal winter. I pushed Wyatt out the front doors of the hospital, in a wheelchair. He insisted he didn't need but was secretly thrilled about because it meant he could go faster than walking. Grant was waiting by the car. Not his Range Rover, he'd apparently learned his lesson about the ambulance bay, but a practical SUV that Becca had rented for the drive back to New Haven. He was holding a bag of Wyatt's belongings and a stuffed bear named Mr. Logistics, and when Wyatt saw him he yelled, "Dad!" with the kind of uncomplicated joy that made my throat tighten. Grant's face did something I had never seen before. It crumpled, not dramatically, not performatively, but in the quiet, private way of a man who has just been handed something he doesn't deserve and knows it. He crouched down to Wyatt's level and hugged him, carefully, gently, mindful of the IV port still embedded in his chest. And I stood a few feet away and watched the two of them hold on to each other in the spring sunlight. And I thought about the snowstorm, 7 years ago in the kitchen floor, and the way this man had looked at me like I was nothing, and I thought about how strange it was that the same man was now kneeling on a hospital sidewalk, holding our son, like he was the most precious thing in the world. People can change, I know that, but change is not a destination, it's a practice, and he has a long way to go before I trust the practice. The drive back to New Haven was quiet. Wyatt fell asleep in the back seat within 20 minutes, Mr. Logistics tucked under his chin, his breathing deep and even and free of the rattling cough that had haunted him for weeks. Grant drove. I sat in the passenger seat and watched the Connecticut landscape roll past the window. The familiar highways, the familiar exits, the familiar weight of a life I had built from nothing in a state that had once tried to break me. "What happens now?" Grant asked. His eyes were on the road. His hands were steady on the wheel. "Now," I said, "Wyatt recovers. He goes back to school. He plays soccer. He complains about homework. He does all the things he was supposed to do before his body decided to betray him. And me?" I looked at him, really looked at him. The lines around his eyes were deeper than they had been 3 weeks ago. His hair was longer, less styled, like he'd stopped caring about the magazine cover version of himself. He looked tired. He looked human. He looked like a man who had just realized that his empire was built on a foundation of loneliness, and that the only thing that had ever been real was the night he spent crying on a kitchen floor with a girl he didn't bother to learn the name of. "You earn your way in," I said. "Slowly, on Wyatt's terms, not yours. You show up when you say you're going to show up. You don't make promises you can't keep. You don't try to buy your way into his life with gifts and vacations and private jets. You do the boring stuff, the homework help, the school pickups, the Saturday morning pancakes, the stuff that actually matters." He nodded. "And you? I'm not a prize to be won, Grant. I'm not going to fall into your arms because you donated bone marrow and cried in a hospital hallway. That's the bare minimum. What you did was what any decent human being would have done if they'd known their child was dying. I'm glad you did it. I'm grateful. But gratitude is not the same as trust, and trust is not the same as love. I understand, he said finally, and I'm not going to rush you. I'll wait as long as it takes. Don't wait for me, I said. Wait for Wyatt. He's the one who deserves your attention. I've been fine on my own for 7 years. I'll be fine for 7 more if I need to be. He glanced at me, and there was something in his eyes that looked a lot like respect. Not the performative respect of a man trying to win an argument, but the genuine, hard-won respect of a man who has just been told the truth and has decided to listen instead of argue. You're the strongest person I've ever met, he said quietly. I almost laughed. If only you'd realized that 7 years ago, we wouldn't be having this conversation in a rental SUV on I-95. I know, I said. 6 months later, October in New Haven is my favorite time of year. The leaves turn gold and red. The air gets crisp, and the city feels like it's taking a deep breath after the chaos of summer. Wyatt was back in school, back on the soccer field, back to being the loud, curious, impossibly kind kid he had always been. His blood counts were stable. His energy was through the roof. He had gained 5 pounds and grown 2 inches, and every time I looked at him running across the playground with his classmates, I felt a gratitude so fierce it made my ribs ache. Grant came to New Haven every other weekend. He followed the rules I had set. No surprises, no grand gestures, no attempts to insert himself into my life beyond what Wyatt wanted and needed. He picked Wyatt up from soccer practice. He helped him with math homework, which was apparently a humbling experience for a man who had an MBA from Wharton but could not explain long division to a second grader. He took Wyatt to the park, to the library, to the ice cream shop on Chapel Street, where Wyatt always ordered 3 scoops regardless of the 2-scoop rule. He did not try to kiss me. He did not try to hold my hand. He did not show up at my apartment with flowers or jewelry or any of the expensive props that men in his tax bracket typically use to signal romantic intent. He just showed up, consistently, quietly, without expectation. And slowly, incrementally, the wall between us began to crack. Not collapse, not crumble, just crack, enough to let a little light through. It was a Saturday afternoon in late October when I found myself sitting on a bench in Edgerton Park, watching Wyatt chase a soccer ball across the grass with a group of kids from his class. The leaves were falling around us in slow, spiraling drifts of gold and crimson. The air smelled like wood smoke and apple cider. It was the kind of afternoon that felt like a deep breath after holding it for 7 years. Grant sat down next to me on the bench, not too close. He respected the space I had given him, and he always waited for me to close the distance if I wanted to. Today, I did move away. He's getting faster, Grant said, nodding toward Wyatt, who had just stolen the ball from a kid twice his size and was sprinting toward the goal with the kind of determination that made my chest swell with pride. He gets that from me, I said. Grant smiled. It was a real smile, not the polished camera-ready smile he used for magazine covers, but the quiet, crooked smile that I had seen exactly once before, on a snowy night in a kitchen in Greenwich 7 years ago. I missed 7 years of his life, he said. His voice was low, steady, stripped of the defensiveness that had defined our early hospital conversations, because I was too proud to see the person standing right in front of me. I don't expect you to forgive me, Jenna. I don't expect any of this to be easy. I just want you to know that I see you now, not the housekeeper, not the complication, you. The woman who built a company from nothing, who raised an incredible kid on her own, who stood in a hospital hallway and told me the truth when every instinct in her body was screaming to protect herself. I see you. And I'm sorry it took the worst moment of your life to make me open my eyes. I looked at him. I looked at the man who had broken my heart in a snowstorm and was now sitting on a park bench in New Haven, watching our son play soccer, asking for nothing except the chance to be present. I didn't say I forgive you. I wasn't ready, and I didn't owe him the comfort of absolution. Forgiveness is not a transaction. It's not something you hand over because someone has suffered enough. It's a process. And mine was still unfolding, still messy, still full of nights where I woke up angry and mornings where I looked at Wyatt's face and felt the old wound reopen. But I said something else, something that was true and honest, and enough for now. I know, I said, and I let him stay on the bench. We sat there together in the October sunlight, watching our son run across the grass with a soccer ball at his feet and a laugh that carried across the park like music. And I thought about the empire Grant had built, and the empire I had built, and the strange, complicated truth that neither of those empires mattered as much as the small, ordinary, irreplaceable moment of sitting on a bench with the person who had hurt you most and choosing, not to forget, but to begin. The empire didn't cost Grant his soul. It cost him 7 years of his son's life. And he would spend the rest of his days understanding that no amount of money, no amount of power, no amount of boardroom victories or magazine covers or billion-dollar deals could ever buy back a single missed bedtime story, a single missed soccer game, a single morning he should have woken up next to the woman who had sat with him on a kitchen floor during the worst night of his life and told him, simply and without condition, that she gave a damn. He had everything. And for 7 years he had nothing. Now he was learning the difference. And I was learning that the strongest thing a person can do is not to close their heart after it's been broken, but to open it again, carefully, slowly, on their own terms, and let the light back in. Wyatt scored a goal. He threw his arms in the air and screamed with joy, and Grant stood up from the bench and cheered louder than any other parent on the field, and I sat there and watched the two of them, the father and the son, the billionaire and the boy, the man who had everything and the child who had taught him what everything actually meant, and I smiled. Not because the story was over, but because the next chapter was finally, impossibly ours to write.